apparently, wokeness isn't Marxist. Now, someone should let the woke people know that because apparently they haven't got the memo.
Welcome to the Wokepedia podcast. The Wokepedia podcast is brought to you by Enemies Within the Church, and you can find out more about Enemies Within the Church at enemieswithinthechurch.com. And of course, there you can get the documentary Enemies Within the Church. And yes, in that documentary, there is an exposing that there are Marxists who are in the church, and yes, they are woke. Kyle, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good overall. I'm, sun's shining. Happy to be here. Excited to do another episode of the Wokepedia podcast. Hopefully, be a valuable, helpful, and useful resource, and to answer a question that feels obvious to us, but there's some confusion on. But Sam, how are you doing? And you excited to get into today's topic?
My head's spinning just a little bit here on the fact that we have to do this topic. I was looking at my bingo board, and while looking at my bingo board, I definitely had biological man thinks he's a woman on my bingo board because of the world that we live in, and I definitely had because we're in June, that cats started throwing up rainbows in celebration of Pride Fest, things like that. But I did not have that the woke are not Marxist, and especially from the perspective of conservatives bringing that narrative up. Did not have that one on my bingo board this month. That is for certain. So yeah, my head's spinning just a little bit. But like you said, the sun's shining. In fact, I don't know how warm it is out in the Pacific Northwest, but it has been in the 90s all week here, maybe even a week and a half in Iowa. And so I'm really glad that somebody invented air conditioning. That's what I'm thankful for today.
Oh, that's something there's just not enough air conditioning out here. It's just not quite as common as it should be, but it'd be really useful, especially as we're right in the transition between spring and summer right now. So there's we haven't had many thunderstorms. Mm-hmm. We usually do, but we're right on the cusp. Like every day it starts to threaten that there might be a thunderstorm. So it gets really humid suddenly and then it just disappears. Come on, just have the storm come, get it over with. But yeah, you're right. I was not expecting that there'd be confusion on the topic of wokeness is Marxist, but maybe we shouldn't assume things like that. Maybe we should go back and hit some of the ideas that we would see immediately and think are pretty fundamental to this whole discussion. But let's slow down and answer that. And now I know a lot of people that are listening are going to be on board with us. They're already going to go, yeah, I already understand this. I agree with you. I agree that it's Marxist.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even the people that are in that place listen to us because we're going to give some. Now we're not going to be doing a whole master's research paper on this right now. It's going to be just a general overview. There's an article that makes this assertion that we want to discuss later, but we're going to give you some details that are definitely going to give you a little bit more foundation. And that's something we want people to have, is a little bit more foundation for why. Why can we say that woke ideologies are just a flavor of Marxism?
Yeah. And I think that you're right in saying that people are going to be, most of the people who watch this are either going to be haters who they're going to be confused anyway because they're woke, and they're going to be like, well, of course we're Marxist. I mean, what else would we be? Or they're going to be, those who are generally on board with us, and they're going to be surprised at this. But I think this is going to be important because it's not good enough that you just know your position. It's very important that you know how to express your position.
Exactly.
and I think this is going to be extremely helpful. And there's going to be some other things that we tie into this that will help you understand when the woke go and make an accusation against others, perhaps against you, that really it's at least a cousin to who they are, as opposed to who they're trying to say that it is in many ways. But the first definition we're getting into is none other than communism. What in the
Communism.
world is communism, Kyle?
Well,
And I'm not calling you communist Kyle. I'm just saying what is communism? So
yes,
for
comrade.
clarification.
That just reminds me of a terrible, absolutely awful joke. Because people always say, "See, Kyle," as they're pointing something out, and I'm like, "Whoa, man, whoa, we're not Nazis here."
All right. So what is communism on that note?
Well, and that this is probably an important thing to bring up is Marxism and all of its offshoots and all of its derivatives. They have a goal, but it's an impossible goal. They want a utopia outside of God. They want a godless, perfect world, and they think that, in fact, getting rid of God is how you part of achieving that. So
They think that they can have a perfect society with utter lawlessness at the same time. It's really an antinomian derivative, ultimately.
Oh yeah. Well, so that raises the question of when you are talking about these definitions, and it sounds like a little bit of a cliche because are you talking about actual communism or what it is in practice? But that's an important thing that we need to distinguish between is
Right.
the theory and the practice. Now, communism, when we're talking about a communist state, because we're going to talk about the practice of it, because that's how people are using it. If you out there are saying the word communism, I'm assuming that when you're saying that, you're talking about communist China, communist Russia, communist United States. Communist Biden. Oh, I'm sorry. But
yes,
communism in its sort of governmental form and its state form is it, Sam, I'll ask you a question. In that form, is it the end or is it a transitional state?
In the form of when it's a state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I suppose it depends on which state, but it's transitional because they're not to their utopia yet.
Mm-hmm. Now, in function, has any communist state, and I promise this is part of defining it. I like to define it in practice too, because that gives you more foundation. But in practice, has there been a single communist state that has moved towards its utopia, made even an ounce of progress towards its utopia?
No.
No. So we have to deal with the fact that communism is a transitional state of Marxism between the Marxist revolution and the utopia that it's supposed to bring about. Communism is one of the intermediate attempts to bring about the Marxist utopia. It is a globalist ideal. It is the dictatorial state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. What that means, it's the working class has risen up, and now they need a dictatorial state. They need an empowered state to make the necessary changes to get them to their utopia. It is a socialistic form of government. It is a dictatorial form of government. It has to lack any representation by competing political ideologies, aka other political parties. It has to
So,
be a one-party system.
can I present something to you here? And I'm going to make the contrast, the what I think is the right contrast here as well between this. But I think that this will go right along with what you're saying. So I'm just going to read a couple sentences here from an article that I recently put out, and I think it goes right along with this. When it comes to liberty, there are two competing worldviews. One worldview is that of tyrants, or we could say communists in this case, and holds the perspective that that it is the government who gives permission to the people to be their subjects. The other worldview is that of our founding fathers and is rooted in the Word of God. They held that the people who gave permission to the government to govern, or in the sense that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Um, One is top down, the
Mm-hmm.
other is bottom up, but the top down is saying, we're giving you permission to be part of our subjects. The government is above the individuals that would make up the nation in
Mm-hmm.
communism.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's well, the government has to function and replace God because it's kicked God out of the
Right.
picture. So it has to be a theological dictatorship. It has to replace the role of multiple things. Now, one of the reasons being slightly vague in the definition of communism is we have to talk about socialism. We have
Right.
to define socialism so we have a better understanding of what communism is and answer a specific question, Sam. And I'll ask you the question: are communism and socialism, despite the way that people use it far too often, are they synonyms?
So this is actually a tough question. And this is why all communists are socialists. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all socialists are communists, but they're going to be. That's that's kind of the way that I would describe it. Socialism is progressing towards communism. In that way, it's kind of the intermediary bridge, but it's the same thing. It's just questioning if you're applying it to only economics or if you're also applying it to the government, which if you truly apply to economics, you have to apply it to the government. So in
Mm-hmm.
some ways I would say yes. In other ways, I do understand if you want to be nuanced, but you can't really make a distinction between the two because socialism always becomes communism in its logical conclusion. Is that fair?
I think there's some points we might need to explore, and we're going to explore as we continue to define things. Um, but now, what is socialism? Because you talked about economics and you talked about government, but what is socialism?
Right. So socialism is an economic theory. And it's a theory that you don't own private property. That's pretty much the really simple version of it, that you don't own private property, that it is owned by, if you talk to socialists, they'll say by the public or by the social contract, perhaps is what they might try to say. Um, but ultimately, it's owned by the government. The government decides what you have and what you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, and of course, that requires extremely high tax rates because they're taking it and they're redistributing it.
Yeah. It's a collectivist idea. There is not an individual, there's only the group. And therefore,
Right.
the group owns everything, not the individual. But unfortunately, when everyone owns everything, no one owns anything. I mean, it's the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset thing. You
Right.
will own nothing and you will be happy. They
Hmm.
honestly believe that that's how you usher in utopia.
Right.
Unfortunately, again, it's a theory that can never actually come about. There can never be
Hmm.
that state because someone will always own it. It will be the state, and who controls the state controls everything.
Exactly.
Now let's jump one of our definition on the list, and let's jump straight to Marxism because I think we need to explain what Marxism is, and
Okay.
it'll
We're gonna jump
continue.
down.
we're going to jump one and then we'll jump back.
Okay.
But I think we need to explain it because explaining Marxism will clarify socialism, will clarify
Right.
communism.
I think you're right, because ultimately they're all the children of Marxism ideologically, at least. Even though that's not necessarily timing wise the way that it happens, it's the way that it is a lot of times. So Marxism is and we're just talking classical Marxism here. It's a economic theory, although it's more than an economic theory, and I think that's important also
Mm-hmm.
to understand. But in the basic sense, it's an economic theory of class warfare of the worker versus the owner, essentially, of rising up, where you've got the oppressed versus the oppressor, or the proletariat versus the bourgeois. And as they're going and confronting with one another, then they apply socialism to that, because it's the oppressed versus the oppressor. So therefore, we need to have a collectivist put everybody on a level playing field so that there is no class warfare that's going on. And of course, then it's also the idea of communist, because you have the government over the citizens there in distributing what
Yeah.
comes from it.
So
But
can I put it this way to clarify what you're saying? Marxism is the theory, socialism is the system, and communism is the form of government.
yes, exactly, exactly. I and another thing to look at this, because this is important to understand. Marx's goal was not just to destroy capitalism, but it was also to dethrone God.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that we see basically in the Bible is the idea of private property, um, where God goes and he sets up Adam and Eve in the garden, and he says, "Look, I'm giving you the whole garden. You're getting all of these trees that you can go and gather fruit from. You can go and do all of this, but there's one tree that's my tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat of it. It's my tree." That's what God goes and says. Well, that's inherently the opposite of socialism, because
Mm-hmm.
socialism doesn't say that you don't have a my tree, and so therefore God couldn't have a my tree. And then also, as we've mentioned several times here now, communism as the government has to replace God, because it has to be the
Mm-hmm.
top entity. And so when we're looking at Marxism, socialism, communism, it's not just merely that they're against capitalism, although they all three are. It's also that they are inherently all three against God.
Yeah. They're against God. They're against God's created order.
Right.
And now here's one thing, and I think this is key. Now I'm slightly jumping ahead a little bit, but you have Darwin come and he
Hmm.
gives justification to the modernist, the scientific age of rejecting God.
Right.
Now they have a system where they can say we no longer need God, even though that doesn't work at all. But Marx responds to that. That gave him the foundation he needed to make his theories. Now, one of the reasons now he was primarily concerned with economics, but
Hmm.
if you read Marxism itself, if you read the works of Marx and the early communists and the early Marxists, it was always more than simply economics. That's just what they thought was the driver. They thought
Right.
that was going to be the thing that drives everything forward.
Do you mean to
Uh,
read that quote from the Communist Manifesto?
let's hold off on the quote. No, no,
Okay.
let's read it now because the quote's so fun. We need something. We're talking about boring stuff. We need something exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is from the Communist Manifesto, which I won't lie. I have the Communist Manifesto, but I didn't have it on my computer, and so I got a little bit nervous as I was downloading this from Marxist.com. I was like, man, it, the only thing worse than a computer virus is a Marxist computer virus. But
No,
fortunately, I
it's
don't
fine.
think my
It's just going to
computer's sick.
It's just going to redistribute all your RAM evenly among all the programs.
Right, exactly. That'd be wonderful. Um, Anyway, this is the quote. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare-up of the infamous proposal of the communists, on what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeois, but this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletariats and in public prostitution.
Yeah, so Marx was
Marx
against
was
more than
anti-family.
just, yeah. He was against everything that God stood for. Now, but here's the point I was going for, because you already see that it's more than simply economics.
Right.
He just
And
thought
by the way,
economics was the thing.
right. So as a point too, this is from the Communist Manifesto. This is from the horse's mouth. So
Hmm.
it well, maybe it was Engels who wrote that part, but either way, it still works here. In
Yeah.
the issue that we see this as, it's much more than an economic theory.
Yeah, it is definitely more. But one of the things that we hadn't seen yet is not simply just Nietzsche himself, because he was a contemporary, slightly later, but still a contemporary. Um, but the point that Nietzsche brings out doesn't catch on among all these guys until later, which is that if God is dead, then everything that God brings is dead as well. You can
Right.
see Marx, he's trying to attack the family, but Nietzsche takes it a step further. He's like, guys, no, if God is dead, then everything that goes with him, all his morality, all his order, all his design, everything is gone. Blank slate, guys. We get to make this is both a terrifying thing and a freeing thing. Everything is permissible now.
Right. It,
And this is you should see a progression of things as people realize, we're seeing the advancement of modernism. We're seeing the advancement of the quote death of God. So you should see people going more and more, okay, what does it mean that God is dead? What does it mean that we're now gunning for Marxism? We're gunning for this utopia without God. So you should see an advancement in what is permissible.
and this is the interesting thing when you're looking at this, because I think you bring it up really well, that Marx, didn't really quite understand the full implication of what he was saying, and he really did. Um, he 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 missed the marks here when. Sorry, I had to get that in there at some point,
Yeah,
but he really
that was
did
an
miss it.
interesting angle to take on it.
Oh man, that I didn't see that one coming. Um, that was good. Uh, he comes at this, and he goes and he thinks that capitalism is the driving force in the family, as opposed to the family being the driving force in the capital gain there.
Hmm.
But his work was built upon. And should we go there,
Hmm.
or do we want to go back to? Yeah, let's go ahead and let's go there. Kyle, what is
Yep.
cultural Marxism?
Well, this is probably the simplest definition. Now, we should probably need to explain the definition, but this is probably the simplest definition. It is Marxism, so the system of Marxism, the system
Hmm.
of Marx and Engels, the system that we're talking about, applied to culture rather than economics. Now,
Right.
is it devoid of that economic emphasis? No.
No.
They would both agree on socialism, but what they're doing is exactly what you were saying there. Is Marx said capital creates the family, and cultural Marxists realized no, it's actually the other way around.
Hmm.
A strong nuclear family creates capital. There
Right.
is So what do we mean by that? It means that there is ownership, there is order, there is hierarchy, all of these things, and that reflects into society. That creates a system in society that is always going to tend towards, wherever there is a nuclear family, it's always going to tend towards some form of capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the natural order of God's design. Now,
Exactly.
again, cultural Marxists, they see, okay, well, Marx was right in his theories, Marx was right in his goals, Marx was right in all these things. The problem is he put his effort into the wrong thing. He put his effort into the economics. We're going to put our effort into the culture. We're going to do things such as destroy the family, and that will tear down the economic system as well.
Right. And I would add one more distinction between the two that was in there, and that is Marx believed, therefore, in a materialistic, bloody revolution. So literally a revolution by force of we're going to
Mm-hmm.
go to war with you guys. That's what he was calling
Yeah.
for. Whereas in the cultural Marxists go and they say, no, we're going to have a cultural revolution, and the war that they're going to have is going to be played in the war of words and the war of propaganda and the war of ideologues, or information
Yeah.
wars. And it's really interesting because they've been doing this for quite some time. Um, because you got Antonio Gramsci, and then I mean, really, probably one of the greatest cultural Marxists of all time. You've got Saul Alinsky, who goes and comes up with the rules for radicals, and doing all of this. But oftentimes we're playing their game, and we're not as good at it because we haven't been doing it for 100 years,
Yeah.
and they have been.
Yeah.
But there was one more definition that we needed to get to, in this as well. And it's one that I'm sure many people have heard before. And actually, there's two definitions that go along with this, but it's Nazism and fascism. Um, what is a Nazi?
Well, and this is the secret that the left doesn't want you to know. Um, Nazism, Nazi, translated in English, what does it mean? National Socialism. It's a nationalist form of socialism.
Right.
Now, what on the traditional left right spectrum? Where are the Nazis and where are the fascists always placed?
Everybody always places them on the right,
On
but
so
that's
on
not where I place them.
the conservative side, um, is there such thing as conservative socialism?
No.
No, those are contradictory things. You cannot by definition have a conservative form of socialism. Can you have a conservative form of nationalism?
Yes.
Can you have a liberal form of nationalism?
Mm, a liberal or leftist?
Well, I mean, just go classical liberalism first. Can you have a classical liberal form of nationalism?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
I
I
don't
mean,
want to
where
give
does
it to them,
liberalism? You don't want
but
to give it to them,
yeah.
but it's true. I mean, what was the first
Yeah.
country that kind of we saw classical liberalism birth into? It's French
Yep.
Revolution, which was
They were
very,
nationalists.
yeah. So nationalism can shift around. Socialism can't. It is an explicitly left ideology.
Right.
Now, in talking about fascism, well, first, Sam, before I make this point, what would you say are the distinctive differences between, because these are forms of government, and
Mhm.
that's going to be play a key role in this next point, but these are forms of government. What is the key distinction between fascism and communism as forms of government?
Yeah, so the key distinction is who is the the enforcement, essentially. here, whether it's the business forcing the agenda, which would be fascism, or the civil government enforcing, being the enforcing mechanism, which would be communism there. Um, and was I supposed to distinguish between communism and fascism, right?
Yeah,
Or okay,
just as
yeah,
form the general idea of the difference between forms of government.
right. So it would be which one of these two would be going out and enforcing, but it's generally the same ideology.
Yeah, and the biggest kind of differentiation is communism looks global and multinational. Fascism, nationalist looks inward.
Hmm.
Now, this is fascinating when you look at history with those, and there's other things. There's going to be other flavors that are going to be difference between the two. We're again a general distinction between the ideologies. They're both socialist ideologies, but it's fascinating when you look at things and you realize that a lot of people that we call communists probably wouldn't fit under that term as much as they'd fit under fascists. Should we
Yeah,
talk about Stalin at all? Because that guy would not have actually fit well as a communist. He was very nationalist. He wanted to remove all other nationalities. I mean, he was very, yeah, we're Russian. Yeah, we're gonna eliminate. We're gonna kill all these other people. But so, what is the thing that they have in common? It's socialism.
yep.
Is there any idea? Is socialism an exclusively Marxist ideology, or can other ideologies use socialism?
I'm desperately thinking of another ideology that could use socialism, but I think anytime you use socialism, you got to bring Marxism with you.
Well,
That's
yeah, they're linked
you
at the hip,
right. I mean,
and they're
it's
they're two different things because again, one's the theory and one's the an application.
right, but you can't apply the theory without bringing the theory. Like, like I
Exactly.
mean, yeah,
And as soon as you apply, as soon as you have the application of socialism, it's at the minimum, its implications will start rapidly importing Marxism. Now,
right.
here's one of the important things, and why I want to point that out is where did the fascists come from? Like, let's talk about Mussolini. Where did his fascism rise from? What was he?
A communist, a
Yeah,
Marxist.
yeah. And as there was this rush at the beginning, moving from the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. There's this rush of what's going to be the first country that goes communist? What's going to be the first, well, not communist, what's going to be the first Marxist revolution? Where's it going to be successful? There's energy. Everyone's on board with it. The problem is because it's an ideology that can't actually work. It's always going to collapse.
Right.
It's never going to reach its utopia. It's always going to collapse into something wicked. And uh, again, there's this rush of how do we successfully apply Marx's theory to reality. And there were competing ideas of how to accomplish that. And so you see
Right.
this splintering. Why? Like Spain, it became a showdown. It splintered and became a showdown of communists versus national socialists. Italy, it became a splintered and became a showdown of communists versus national socialists. Germany, same thing.
Hmm.
The Marxist revolution was successful, and then they all had to go, oh, shoot, but what's going to be the form of government? What's going to be
Right.
the dictatorship that leads us to the Marxist utopia?
It, and to prove that point, there are many people in all of these revolutions who they might have gone and fought against each other every once in a while, but they would literally just change their shirt color in order to show who they were supporting. Um, and that's what they would be going and doing, is just changing that. But they're all on the same side, They're just going, I might have a preference in this area or a preference in that area, but at the end of the day, we're Marxist. At the end of the day,
Hmm.
we're communists. At the end of the day, we're however you want to go and look at that. They're socialists. They're communists. We generally use communism as the overarching term, but
Hmm.
that's what they're going like. That's where their loyalties laid.
Yeah. And I would say that if you're kind of ranking national socialism versus communism, globalist socialism, I would say that communism is closer to the theoretical ideas of Marxism than fascism is. I think
Yeah,
fascism is much more pragmatic, but again, you can't deny that they're the men. Look at the countries that they formed these systems of government. You can't ignore that they have a common root in socialism and a common root because of that in Marxism. Why is
right.
this important? I really want to emphasize the fact that when leftists use fascist as an insult, they are really using a boogeyman. Really,
Yes,
really, really using a boogeyman to try and blast anything that is actually on the right. Why? Because they're communists, they're Marxists, and they're trying to push their revolution. And they know that fascism is hated. They got it labeled as a right ideology. Why? Because they want to suppress their opponents. We're their opponents. They're going to call us fascists. They're going to put that as something that they're not.
right. And when you go and you look at that, really, because I think you hit the nail on the head when you're saying that fascism or not Nazism is much more pragmatic. And it's because that idea of fascism, when you go and you start looking at the national side of things, they don't mind it being an oligarchy in order to accomplish their um, accomplish their goals essentially. So
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to 2020, we go and we see fascism in the United States all over, um, where you would have governments who would basically be saying, government entities becoming coming out and saying like, we need mask mandates. We need to have mask mandates. We need to be having this kind of stuff. But then ultimately, it wasn't a police force that forced most people to wear the mask most of the time. It was a management force that was being brought down at the companies that they were working at, going and saying, if you don't put a mask on, you're going to be fired. And
Mm-hmm.
so, therefore, it was the government who was going and giving the order, so to say. And then it was the corporations going and implementing that, which in some ways makes them an oligarchy. Of course, there are higher ones up. If your last name's Gates, you might be a little bit higher than other people with different last names. Um, but we go and we see that that ideology. And so it's a lot more pragmatic
Mm-hmm.
because you can get more people going and working on that. Whereas then when you're looking at communism in the global sense, it, it's a lot more difficult because you're having to get either other nations under one ideology and one leader in all of those kind of ways. But it really is just kind of a bigger scale of fascism in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
Well, you're going to see again because they have common origins, they have common links. Now there are different. They both pull in different elements from outside.
Yeah. Yes.
That's going to happen no matter what. No theory is perfectly pure. It's always going to be adopted, and then within one strain, you're going to see different applications of it as well. But you should see crossovers between the two. Again, it's why 2020, despite the uh, much more communist government that we have in the United States, you see fascism
Right.
implemented.
Now, now, it, if we're bringing this back to the original question, are the woke Marxist? I think it's helpful to come up with just a few key traits. And so, with all of these isms that we've been looking at, communism, socialism, Marxism, Nazism, we're just calling them Nazis, but fascism, there we go. all the isms. Would it be fair to say that these are probably a few of the main traits?
Mm,
One is a collective ideology that categorizes people as a group and not an individual.
yeah, I think that's a radical key thing. And we're talking about the woke versus the classical Marxist, and they both do the same thing. But we see the only difference we see is one is rooting it in modernism, in quote science, in
Hmm.
evolution, fake science, and the other is rooting it in postmodernism. There is no truth; it's all just your truth, your reality. So it's a idea, it's a social construct,
One
not
is Darwin, one is Freud.
exactly.
Um, the second main idea that I really see is I think we have to get the economic aspect in there. And so it is a redistribution of wealth,
Hmm.
is kind of the main thing there. And do the woke believe in a redistribution of wealth?
Oh, to the nth degree, and they don't. Out of oftentimes woke people, your generic woke people, will try and argue that they're not communists, but then they have no qualms about socialism.
Right. It,
They'll say we're not Marxists, but we like socialism.
right. Well, and then even applying it to cultural Marxism, they actually redistribute wealth based upon cultural ideologies,
Yep.
like critical race theory through
Yep.
reparations.
Yep.
That's what they're wanting. I mean, that's just socialism applied to culture. That's
E-
really taking socialism outside of the economic
exactly.
realm and putting it into culture, except it still has that economic aspect to it because it really is socialism there.
It's following the implications. Really, is all it's doing. Hey, if we're
Right.
applying socialism in this one way, shouldn't we also apply it in this other way?
Right. So we have redistribution of wealth. We have also that idea of the collective as opposed to the individual. But
Hmm.
here's then a third thing that I think that is extremely distinctive of Marxism, and that's class warfare.
Hmm.
Do we have class warfare? The bourgeois versus the proletariat. Do we have the bourgeois versus the proletariat in wokeism?
That's all they're trying to create is class warfare. That's that every name a branch of critical theory, whether it's queer theory, whether it's critical race theory, gender theory, all these different ones. It is all just creating a specific antagonistic class warfare group, and then
Right,
applying, it's applying Marxism to that. Okay, let's take this and apply it to this category and force the conflict. They're trying to force a cultural revolution, and they're injecting it into it, whatever it is, whether it's critical race theory and trying to create a divide in humanity that isn't there, and say you
right,
have one skin tone, therefore you are this, you have another, therefore you are this, and you are oppressed and you are oppressor, and now fight each other, and we're going to watch, and we're going to gain power as you do that.
right. And okay, so I've got three. So we have three main things. I'm going to give. I don't want to say minor things, but these three things kind of fit into the three things we just talked about as distinctives. But I think I stated before that Marx said his goal was to destroy capitalism and to dethrone God. And then we also read from the Communist Manifesto that one of the goals is to abolish the family.
Hmm.
Right. So now these aren't the only goals of Marxism, but I think they're three very prevalent goals of Marxism that we see.
Hmm.
And we can see these, all three of these in Marxism and in neo Marxism or cultural Marxism, new Marxism, cultural Marxism. But I want to know, do we see these three things inside of the woke? Because, following here, we would see that if wokeism is Marxism, that it would have similar goals. Um, does wokeism seek to destroy capitalism?
Yeah, they go on and on about how evil capitalism is.
Right. And now, what about it? And I know we're going to get into this a little bit more when we go into that article that we referenced earlier. But just just give a little tease to this. What about the corporations that are pushing wokeism? I mean, corporations are obviously capitalists, right?
Oh my goodness, that's what. Okay, I really want to go on a rant about crony capitalism and how we're not even a capitalist system. But
Right.
no, just because there is a corporation that exists does not mean it's a capitalist entity. It is a
Right.
there's different forms of profit, and they are seeing their gain in other ways.
Right. So
They're
an
instruments
example,
of the revolution.
right? It's a perfect example of this would be Target right now. They're down. I don't even know how many billion of dollars by the time that you listen to this podcast. But the reality of it is that Target doesn't mind taking the financial loss. That's why all these
Mm-hmm.
corporations have they say go woke, go broke, but yet they keep going woke. Why? Because they're not capitalists. They are seeking a cultural influence
Mm-hmm.
as their currency more than they are seeking um, more than they're seeking actual capital gain. And this is because the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they're seeking to accomplish.
Well, and
That's
plus
what they're
beyond
seeking
that,
to do.
they get if they grovel at the feet of the revolutionaries enough, they will be the chosen ones. They'll be the
Right.
chosen corporations that get to absorb all the others. They get the assets of everyone else. They get to be um, the ones that survive. They get to be sitting on top. So they're making the investment, an ideological investment in their future.
Right.
They're pushing the revolution because Target's never going to beat Walmart
Right.
economically. But if Target can be the corporation, the chosen corporation that the government protects,
Then they can't
well,
lose.
they can't lose. Exactly. So you see,
Now,
it's kind of a mix of
of
fascism.
fascism.
Well, it's a bit of a mix of fascism and kind of the functional oligarchy that forms in communism,
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Because
there's
basically,
still companies.
right, they're not going to be Stalin. They're just going to be the guys who first get the orders from Stalin. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, N- Now, with this, though, it's not just that idea of destroying capitalism, but then it's also dethroning God. Do you think that wokeism? I see it. It's hard to even ask these questions with a straight face. The fact that we're having to do this podcast, not the defining of the terms, I figured that'd be good, but the fact that people are actually from the right, from conservative places, are trying to say that woke isn't Marxism. I,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, come on now, take your head out of the microwave. It's it's one of those things where you're like, what's going on? But does wokeism seek to dethrone God?
Oh, 100%. In fact, it's doing it. It's a more honest version of Marx's original attempt to dethrone God. It's just chasing the implications to every aspect of reality. Again, it's
Mhm.
they've caught on to the fact that, quote, God is dead. So now we got to remove every vestige of him. We got to remove
Right.
everything of Christianity, get it all out of here. It's irrelevant. It's soft morality. We need the hard morality of the supermen that are going to rise up and take the reins. And how do we do that? Well, we have to engage the culture. We have to change the culture through a cultural revolution. And there's a lot of people that are betting that, again, like the corporations, that they're going to be the ones that are on top once the dust settles.
Right. And so we think about that term dethroning God, which is Marxist term. That's not my term. That's Marxist term.
Yes.
We look at this and we go, okay, what with the woke, is God still the king of the family in the woke paradigm? No, absolutely not, because a king has laws, and they go and they say, we're going to cast off God's laws. Homosexuality, it's there. Is God even the king of gender? No, absolutely not. You're the king of gender. Your laws count. Your gender is fluid. You can be
Mm-hmm.
any gender you want, make up 32 genders, and be all 32 of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And
Right?
the early Marxists, they were already pushing into that territory from day one. The problem was that they ran into is society, culture wasn't ready for that. So they
Right.
eventually backed off mostly, and then started drip feeding it over time. But it was really the cultural Marxists that found the key to getting to shifting culture rapidly on these issues,
Right.
not very slowly over time.
Right. And you could go with every major issue that the woke have, and you can go and see that God is no longer God in their paradigm, that he is no longer king, that there are no longer laws, his laws that apply, but it is merely their laws. And I mean, we don't have time to get into this, but just kind of throwing it out there, what they did, because they obviously try to keep a Christian veneer in some cases with this. And that's how they'd say, what do you mean we're trying to dethrone God? Don't you see that, along with our pride flag, we also stand up here with our with our robes, with our clergy collars and clergy robes and things like that, as they're going and breaking every one of God's laws, and that they're completely going against this. But it comes back to that idea of Joseph Francis Fletcher, who brings in situational ethics and replacing God's morality of law, a law based ethics, to a love or a subjective based
Mm-hmm.
ethics where I'm deciding what this means.
Mm-hmm.
And that all plays into it. The third thing, though, that we see, so we have that they're destroying capitalism, they're dethroning God. The third thing is abolishing the family. Do the woke, Kyle. I feel like this is almost a waste of your time to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because apparently some people need to hear this, right? Do the woke seek to abolish the family?
Um, yes, it is
It's
one of
it's
their,
it's like their thing.
yeah. And what is their primary route to doing that? It's still the same as classical Marxism. It is public education.
Yes. I don't think I went that far into the quote, but Marx comes out and says that we need to get rid of private education or home education, and we need to have a public or social education.
Mm-hmm. And again, they're using the same tools. They're using, at the minimum, you have to at least go. They're using the tools of Marxism. They're using the
Right.
tools of Marxism. They have the same end goals of creating a classless society, the Marxist utopia,
Are these
no
the
owning
analytical
of
tools that are so
property.
useful?
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, couldn't
It,
resist.
but it's just the point. They're undeniably using everything that Marxism gives. If you want to go, oh, well, they're postmodernist, they reject truth, but uh, Marxism rooted itself in the pseudoscience of the 19th century, evolution and the like. And you want to say, well, because of that, I want to call it something other than Marxism. But I'm going to admit that it is 100% taking everything and translating it into postmodernism. I will accept that. I think that is a weird position to put yourself in. And it's much simpler to just say, well, Sam, we're going to talk about an article that has made the point. We're going to respond to claims of what is wokeness
Right.
actually, it's not Marxist, and we're going to respond to those things because we think it's important to highlight this. Um, so do you mind if I just do the, walk us out right now?
Yep. Let's do it.
Okay. So if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it attempts to overthrow the bourgeoisie in a glorious revolution of the oppressed classes rising up against their oppressors, and it talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Guys, it's kind of as simple as that. Wokeness really does come down to a Marxist ideal. It is not classical economic Marxism, but you can see even in Marx's own writings, he had more thoughts than just the economic theories. They're consistently applying it. It fits very well into a postmodern society. It is a satanic ideology, and we need to resist it with every ounce that we have from a solid biblical foundation. And it is important to understand its roots in Marxism.
That's right. And if you disagree that that wokeism is Marxism, we want to hear from you. So email us at contactwokepedia@gmail.com. Once again, that's contactwokepedia@gmail.com. And if you agree with us, well, you don't really need to let us know, but we wouldn't mind hearing from you. um, and so go ahead and email us as well at contactwokepedia@gmail.com. But I think that's what we got time for today. And remember, ducks are communists, and keep standing for the truth.
Remember, don't go quack.